officially in the automation session, but I already felt, you know, the how you say, the breeze of the intent-based networking session. So next presentation is from Susan White. Hi, Sue. Sue is the head of the SDN and NFV Portfolio Marketing at Netcracker, and the title of the presentation is The Path to Zero Touch with Domain Orchestration. I think zero touch always makes me shiver a little bit, so I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I think what we need to do with automation is automate the presentations between the speakers. Be a great,
yes, that's a task, definitely.
Anyway, so automation, we've had an awful lot of talks about automation today, and rightly so, because it is the goal. It's the goal of SDN NFV. If we don't automate, you know, we're not going to get all those benefits of service agility, and we've absolutely got to clean up operations in doing so, because we know operations today, they're costly, they're complex, and it's just not getting us to the goals where we want to be, and, you know, 5G services around the corner. So yes, we need to make networks more intelligent. We need to make them more self-sufficient. But to do that, we're actually going to have to change the way we do operations. We just can't continue on the path that we've been going. And that's what I really want to cover today and go through some aspects of that. So first of all, you know, what is it we're trying to automate? Maybe we can start with that and just be really clear. So we're going to look at it from the bottom down, from the network up, if you like, where we have to automate resources. So first of all, we have to know what's in our network. We have to be able to automate the process of knowing everything that's in the network, be able to drill down to any particular bit at any instance in time. Any device that's in the network is automatically discovered. So this piece today, unfortunately, by a lot of service providers, is still using, you know, manual ways of doing things. So that's one key area that we have to automate. And even though with SDN and NFV, we're starting to bring some automation into those domains, we're still not doing that so much in the physical. And yet services cross both domains, so we're going to have to figure out how we automate across both domains. And in general, everything needs to become, you know, a lot more real time. We need this information on the network to be able to act in real time. And once we solve some of those things, we can start moving to the services. So how do we automate services from the top down? So yes, we need to do everything from the VNF onboarding to automate the service design to all the lifecycle actions, be able to add any device into the network and it knows exactly what its job is and it's able to get moving and it knows what it's supposed to do. So that's where we want to be. But we have a lot of issues to get there still. And one of the reasons for that is we still think of operations in a really silo approach. So we have legacy OSS, and if we're going to automate any services right now, there's a lot of capabilities in that OSS framework that we need to deal with. So that's one set. We have SDN and we have NFV at a very high level. Of course, we can break this down much more detailed. So legacy OSS in itself has got a bunch of silos. It's got fulfillment, it's got assurance. These two areas we know don't speak to each other. You don't get closed loop assurance in legacy OSS. We know that. So we have issues there. At the same time, we don't really know what's in the network because the inventory systems are never up to date. We need inventory for all sorts of things for the networks and the services, and a lot of them just don't have the latest information. So that's another issue you find in the networks today. And then we've got the whole FCAPS. So even though we're moving forward with SDN, and we're able to sort of automate the control and many aspects of that, when it comes to, you know, fault, performance and configuration, a lot of this, again, it's very semi-manual or even manual today. So many issues we have to solve in legacy OSS. Then we have the Sdn Silo. And even though we're putting SDN control into data centers and into the WAN environment, it's still operating in very much a domain or layer of the network. We don't really have anything that's able to work across those, and often it's very specific to very vendor products within those areas. So we still have problems there. And then if we want to go beyond to different cloud networks, beyond the service provider cloud, we want to shift resources between a public data center and a service provider data center. Again, those sort of things aren't in place yet. And then in NFV, NFV, we have a lot of capabilities. We should be able to do a lot of automation. We should be able to easily instantiate and scale services up and down, and we have examples of that happening today. But I think for the service providers in the room who've perhaps already moved to virtualize part of your network, how much of that network is actually operated with any automation, or does it still use the manual OSS systems, EMS, NMS systems of the past? So that's the problem with NFV. It's still at those early phases. Yes, we should be able to do it, but even within NFV, we have some gaps. The VNF onboarding, we've been talking about it for years. We have lots of different ways and lots of different groups that are coming up with ways to define those models that are needed for onboarding, the scripts that are needed. But there is still no standard. We don't have license management as a standard yet. We're making good progress there, but there is still no standard way of doing license management. And license management is something that can bring down your entire service if that's not managed in the right way. Maybe it's not an issue if you have one or two vendors in your network, but you're supposed to be able to encourage and have many, many vendors moving to a more cloud native and architecture. You be able to pick and choose from many. But to do that, you have to manage an awful lot more licenses in the network. So we have a lot of gaps within each silo, and we have a lot of gaps between the silos. So that's really what we have to change going forward. So really, we're looking at doing three things. I think it's very clear we have to start merging the functions across these and breaking down these silos, and not thinking of legacy OSS, SDN NFV as these separate domains, and not building services very specific in these domains. We need to fill some of the operational gaps. We'll talk about a few of those. I'm sure there's a lot more you could add to the list, but we'll cover a few. But I think going forward, we also have to think of a different way of architecting and deploying operations. If we think about 5G and the new use cases that people are talking about, very, very low latency use cases, that means distributing compute to the edge of the network to be able to deal with that latency. But when we move to that architecture, then we don't really want centralized orchestration systems because you're not going to be able to cope with the stringent delays that are needed for some services. So then we have to start thinking, well, do we need a different way of being able to actually architect these operational networks and start to actually distribute them as well? And what does that look like? So first, I'll just cover a little bit on each one. In terms of merging the functions, this is what it really looks like. It means we go from these silo environments to having a set of operational functions that work across, where it makes sense, all of these silos. So for example, at the top, there's a few I've put related to services. Service orchestration, service catalog. These are all capabilities that are cross-physical and across virtual networks. They shouldn't be for one or the other. Service orchestration is going to be absolutely critical. You may be building solutions now that have one service or very few services. As soon as you start to add more services, the complexity is huge, and you want to automate that. Service orchestration is going to be critical to get there. And then the next sort of bucket in the middle are more related to resource functions, like configuration management. So again, configuration management, you don't want a system that only works for your virtual network or only works for your physical network. You want something that's across the two and is a hybrid. So all these functions need to be more hybrid. Now, of course, there's some functions, NFV orchestration, that is only for NFV. And certain other functions, SDN controllers is only for SDN. So yes, there'll be some that are specific to their domains. But several of these functions, we need to start thinking they need to be broader. We don't want them to be just fixed to the silo. So in general, they need to be hybrid. Then we can close the loop and we can start actually bringing these domains together. We need that to be real time as well. And of course, to drive all this, we've heard a lot about the analytics, and that's going to play a key part. So just a couple of examples of things that we probably need to fix today. One of them I talked about was configuration management. Again, a process that needs to be across physical and virtual networks. Different ways to do this. One way, for example, is netconf-yang. A lot of physical devices that are put in today are netconf-yang capable. And it's the truth for the VNFs as well. I mean, a lot of VNFs also revert back to standard EMSs to be able to do configuration. So whilst you might have a MANO or network orchestrator to instantiate the service, You still might have to go to a sort of, vendor-driven EMS to actually do that configuration. Well, that can change too. That can come up. NetConf is just an example. It can be a different thing, but the goal is that these things are common processes across both, and we do for physical as we do for virtual. Introduce hierarchical SDN control. Again, not just looking at silo implementations for different layers of the network, be it IP, optical, microwave, or core, or access, or metro. But we start to have hierarchical controllers that give you that end-to-end visibility, and also together with orchestration, look across the entire network. Not just the service provider network, but allows you to look into, beyond that, wherever your resources are placed. And then drive cloud native and actually fix some of the standards. Again, we hear a lot about the cloud native. It is important. I mean, it is important if you want to get the most out of your network and really be efficient when you're automating the life cycle of services. You can do that with a VNF that's not microservice based, but it just makes it more complex when you want to do redundancy. Because you have to, basically duplicate the whole thing, as opposed to the little function within that VNF that might have a problem. So again, it's really, really important to move to that architecture, but it's true for the operations side too. Operations, orchestration needs to be cloud native. They also have to be designed in a way and work with the VNFs in a sort of DevOps environment, so that they both have to be cloud native. It's not just the VNFs we're talking about when we talk about cloud native. And then some standards. We do need to move forward and actually fix some of these standards. We do need standards for onboarding. We do need to fix the standards for license management, because these are now service implementations that are required today. And again, if you're only dealing with a few vendors, it's not a big issue. But as soon as you start mixing and matching and you start growing the number of vendors and commercial agreements you've got, these kinds of things will definitely be more time wasters if you have to do each one individually. So for the last part, I don't know how I'm doing time-wise, but for the last part, I wanted to talk a bit about, this new implementation model, if you like. Moving, if we move towards sort of services that need a very dynamic nature in the network. For example, 5G, we talk about network slicing. Being able to sort of spin up many different slices, hundreds and thousands of slices for different types of services with very different very specific attributes that they need. When we move to that kind of architecture, we will need to think differently about how we deploy an operations environment. And this is where we believe a solution that we call domain orchestration can be very important, because domain orchestration is really where everything in that domain becomes self-sufficient. So it has an orchestration instance. It has an inventory instance. It has a catalog instance. It has different FCAPS instances. So a domain can have many attributes within it that it needs for its domain. Now, what do we mean by a domain? Well, a domain can be a transport domain, or even more narrow, it can be an optical domain or an IP domain. And I'll drill down to some examples of these. It could be a service. We could have an IPVPN service that's its own domain, or it could be a geographical part of the network. So a domain doesn't have to be a fixed thing, but it basically means that within that domain, it's got all the capabilities it needs to be as self-sufficient as possible and reports up with open APIs and talks in a hierarchy to the other domain orchestrators. So this, for example, if we look on the left, we have got one very, very simple one for virtual CPE and one on the right for transport. So you'll see within here, there's a lot of commonality between them. Both of them have got orchestration instances. Both of them have got some FCAPS instances. But in virtual CPE, we also have things like VNF Manager. Very specific to virtual CPE, we have also License Manager in that one. Whereas on the right-hand side for transport, if it's a transport domain that's managing multiple IP optical and even microwave domains below it, we have a multi-layer SDN controller in there. So it just picks the pieces it needs. Now, these are not separate products. We have to stop thinking of these being products, but just instances of software. And this means that we can build, again, these very self-sufficient operation environments that takes what it needs, and therefore you're not constantly going back to a central environment each time, which can massively help the service availability and latency that you need for certain services. So just to finish on a couple of examples, this is an IPVPN example where the IPVPN is decomposed into some various parts. So you'll have a domain orchestration at the service level. And then below that, you'll have domain orchestrators that are very specific to different parts of the network, like the CPE we just talked about, or the transport we just talked about. So there'll be a hierarchy, and these sort of interfaces, if you like, between them, these will be open APIs. These will be things that get defined in, Metro Ethernet forum or TMF forums. They won't be proprietary. They will have to be open APIs. So maybe just to finish on the transport piece of that. So in IPVPN, we showed that there was a transport domain orchestrator. What would that look like compared to today? Well, today, this is a typical network we had before SDN was introduced. We have IP MPLS, and we have optical domains. We had NMSs doing all the FCAPs for those particular products, all feeding up to some kind of legacy OSS environment. Then SDN controllers get added. There's optical SDN controllers, and then we have IP MPLS SDN controllers. So again, they start to bring a lot of value and programmability to those individual domains. And then next step that some service providers are moving to is to sort of be able to see across their whole SDN domain. So be able to do path computation across their entire SDN domain rather than within different domains. So this is kind of the path we're on right now. But it gets pretty complicated as we're sort of moving up the hierarchy and introducing all these new elements. But then on the right-hand side, this is what it could look like. This is the environment that we could have, much more simplified, where at the top we have a domain orchestrator for transport with the key functions that it needs to do the operations it needs at that level of the network. And then below it, we have an IP domain orchestrator and an optical domain orchestrator, and a hierarchical approach with the two. So again, the aim is here to simplify by merging these functions and going away from the sort of very silo approach that we have before. So just to finish, so yes, we've got a path to get to zero touch. There's a lot of things we need to do to automate the networks. But I think what's key is we have to stop thinking of the silos that we have now. We have to break those silos and start to bring these functions together if we're really going to get to a true automated environment. Yes, there's some gaps we know we have to fill, and some of you will have urgencies over some things more than others, depending on the particular needs that you have. And then I think going forward, we need to rethink, even a different model for how we actually deploy orchestration along this kind of domain orchestration environment. Okay, thanks very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Until I spot the hands. So, I mean, NFV is now like 6 years old, right? So we've been in this for a number of years already, and of course you guys. And still I feel like for some of the operators it's like a breaking concept. So how much of a hand-holding lecture is it compared to just, product marketing?
It's really an implementation change. Mm-hmm. So everything we're building right now, everything we're working towards, new service orchestration engines, everything we're moving towards is all becomes components of this new way of looking at things. So it's not revolutionary, but it's an implementation model that we have to think about, particularly as we move forward. Now, some of the things where we talked about, merging some of these functions, that's just imperative. Mm. I mean, now, several of you have probably put SD-WAN in place and other services in place and, for connectivity. But if you want to start adding more services to that, you've got to get to that service orchestration environment. That's across physical and virtual. So we're taking those steps already. That's not sort of future looking. That's happening now. Service providers are putting those systems in place. And because of that, they're saying, okay, well, we'll need to bring some other new pieces to the network as well. It doesn't have to be in one big shot. The whole point of this is to do what you need to make the business work. So I think all that is progressing. But I think that the more forward-looking is doing, is thinking about how we distribute this in a different model.
Right.
But it's not new functions. It's not new. As we're building towards a microservice architecture, then it's leveraging that capability to architect the network in a different way. It's not, let's say, new products.
Right. No, of course. Okay, any more questions? I don't see any. Do you see any? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.